This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, and in this episode 843 of the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, sponsored by FanDuel. Thanks for tuning in. Last week's sleeper picks, they got off to a fire start. Jordan Love and Jaden Reed had a great outing against the Lions on Thanksgiving, and then Curtis Samuel got a ton of volume against the Cowboys. Thanksgiving was great. I also called out Roschon Johnson last week. He had a decent game. Jeff Wilson wasn't that bad either. Greg Dortch scored 12 PPR points, and the defensive streamers, they were solid. But Week 12's show was not as good as Week 11's. The non-Jordan Love quarterback streamers, they were very average. The Ravens' passing attack was not nearly as good as I thought it was going to be against the Chargers. Cade Otton was a disappointment, and most of the running backs were pretty mediocre. Overall, there were definitely some good hits last week, but there were more misses than the week prior. It wasn't great, but it wasn't that bad either. We're on to Week 13. It's a really weird week. We've got some good teams on bye, and I have almost as many picks in the second tier of players this week than the first. That never happens. But we'll start off today's show as we usually do, and that's by looking at players rostered in 10 to 50% of Yahoo leagues who you might be able to play this week. If Chris Olave doesn't go in Week 13, which is honestly the expectation right now as I'm recording this, then I don't think I'd play Derek Carr very confidently. If Olave's in, though, Detroit's a pretty good matchup. The Lions have faced a top 10 pass rate on defense this year, and they're the fifth best matchup for quarterbacks when looking at adjusted fantasy points allowed. They've been specifically bad of late, too. They've given up 4 top 8 performances over their last 5 games. The only quarterback that didn't get there was Jimmy Garoppolo. He's not even starting for his team anymore. It's just that given all of the injuries in New Orleans, it'd be hard to trust Carr as more than a mid to lower end QB2 if Chris Olave is out. But if Olave plays, he's more of a high end QB2 this week. Now, if you'd rather play it safe, Gardner Minshew makes sense. Tennessee is the 3rd worst team this year in EPA per dropback allowed. But they've been fairly average as an opponent for quarterbacks because teams just aren't in a hurry to throw the ball against them. With that being said, the Colts have a decent implied team total. And as I talked about in the 10 Trends episode yesterday, they're regression candidates. More passing touchdowns should be coming. And without Jonathan Taylor in the mix, we might see a slightly more pass-friendly approach close to the goal line for this Colts offense. And then the last quarterback in this tier, it's kind of a surprising one. It's Kenny Pickett. I'm high on Kenny Pickett this week, at least relative to how he's been performing. I know that he's thrown more than 1 touchdown pass in just 1 game throughout his entire career, but I'm calling it right now. I'm getting bold. Kenny Pickett has his best fantasy outing of the season this week. Arizona's a top 7 matchup for quarterbacks by adjusted fantasy points allowed. Pittsburgh has a top 7 implied team total this week, according to FanDuel Sportsbook. And the offense looks so much better, so much more competent last week without Matt Canada. It's a rough week across the board with so many buys, but I think that Kenny Pickett's an okay streamer. And I think that he's going to throw more than 1 touchdown pass. Now, moving on to running backs, I'm going to go back to Ezekiel Elliott, mostly because there aren't many running backs seeing volume who are rostered in fewer than half of Yahoo leagues. Zeke did see a drop in route participation last week. That's a little bit scary for a potential negative game script against the Chargers here in Week 13. But he's been in that 30 to 45% running back rush share range over the last month, giving him 7 to 13 attempts per game. LA is a good matchup too, at least on paper. They've allowed the 10th most adjusted points to the running back position this year. Next on the list is Samaje Perine. There's really a lot of volatility with the 2 Denver running backs not named Javonte Williams. But in Week 12, we did see a little bit more ground game work for Perine. He carried the ball 7 times, he had 55 yards and a score. He hit a 26% running back rush share. Now, I do think that people may be going a little bit overboard with Perine. I didn't mention him on the 15 transactions episode because his peripherals this past week were still not that great. He had a 27% snap share. That was actually lower than his previous 2 games, as was his route participation. But Denver has an interesting indoor matchup against the Texans this weekend, and Perine showed out last week on the ground. Maybe the Broncos reward him with more work. Now, I fully expect Devon Achane to be back this week, but even if he is, Jeff Wilson might steal a little bit of work in that backfield. Not only could Miami just ease Achane back into things, but the Dolphins get the Commanders this week and they're 9.5-point favorites. Washington has a top 10 defense for running backs by adjusted fantasy points allowed. Wilson's obviously a much easier and smarter play when Achane's out, or if Raheem Mostert were to be out. But it's not crazy to think that game script could favor Miami big time in this game. That would in turn help Wilson in garbage time. Now at wide receiver, I only have 2 players for you in this tier. I've got a lot more in the next one. So I'm not expecting this week's sleeper picks to dominate. They're so low rostered, but I'm doing my best here. Anyway, I mentioned it on the 15 transaction show this week, but in that same game between Miami and Washington is Curtis Samuel. Samuel runs the majority of his routes from the slot. Miami's been a team this year that's seen a high target share to that area of the field. They rank 10th in the league in slot target share allowed. Washington's a pass-heavy team, and a potential game script like this could force even more passes. That means that even an 18 and 19% target share for Curtis Samuel could yield 8 or 9 targets. And then I'm going to go back to Demario Douglas too, as long as he's healthy and ready to go. There was a concussion scare this past week, but he told reporters after that game that he didn't have a concussion. So I'm optimistic that he goes. And he gets the Chargers. Douglas himself is seeing a lot of work in this Patriots offense. He scored double-digit PPR points in 4 of his last 5. He's averaging a target share per game rate over this time of 24%. Now, clearly, New England's offense has just been terrible, so he hasn't had any spiked weeks. But he does get the Chargers this week, like I said, and LA's been one of the friendliest, if not the friendliest pass defenses in all of football this year. Now, I've got one tight end streamer for you in this tier, and it's a guy I talked about in the 15 transactions episode. That's Juwan Johnson. Even if Chris Olave does go, I don't mind Johnson. But if he doesn't go, there's definitely a ceiling there. Johnson led Saints pass catchers in routes run this past week, resulting in a 19% target share. He ran a route on almost 85% of New Orleans dropbacks. It's a plus matchup against the Lions, and it's in a game where even if the Saints don't want to throw, they might have to throw. So I think Johnson without Olave is a high-end tight end 2 this week. With Olave, he's more of a mid-range one. This next tier of players consists of guys rostered in fewer than 10% of leagues. Because there are a lot of sleepers in this tier this week, I want everyone to just temper expectations. I know that I'm saying this over and over again, but it's easily the toughest week of the season for me with this show. But hopefully some of these picks can still help you out. At quarterback, Jake Browning is in play, I think. I'd be using someone like Kenny Pickett over him, so I can't imagine that you have to dig this deep, but Cincinnati gets Jacksonville in week 13, and the Jags are the 6th best opponent for quarterbacks in adjusted fantasy points allowed. Browning could have been better last week, but he also wasn't terrible, or as bad as you'd expect from a backup quarterback. And he has decent weapons around him, and we saw a couple of weeks ago he flashed some rushing upside. He ran the ball 4 times for 40 yards. Now, I'm not banking on a huge performance, but maybe someone could benefit from Browning if they're in like a 20-team league. A running back that you could turn to in this tier, obviously a deeper play, it's in that same game, and it's D'Ernest Johnson. Johnson's seen running back rush shares of 20%, 23%, and 25% over his last 3 games. He ended up playing almost 40% of Jacksonville snaps this past week. Now, some of that was because Travis Etienne was banged up for a chunk of that game, but they were using Johnson more even before that. Cincinnati's not only a decent matchup for running backs, but the Jags could lead in this game, giving more non-ETN running backs some playing time. So Johnson makes sense as a result. At wide receiver in this tier, let's go to Jonathan Mingo. He's been playing a lot of snaps and running a lot of routes this year in Carolina's offense. But over the last 3 weeks in particular, he's seen target shares of 21%, 23%, and 25%. Now, he hasn't done that much with them, of course, but he gets Tampa Bay this week. The Bucs are a bottom 4 team in passing EPA per dropback allowed, and they've faced the 5th highest neutral script pass rate in the league. Maybe this is the week that we finally see Jonathan Mingo produce. Jalen Guyton really didn't do anything against Baltimore this past week. He caught 1 pass for 4 yards, but he ran a route on 89% of LA's dropbacks, and he saw a 12% target share. Not great, but not terrible either when you consider the offense that he's in. The Chargers get the Patriots this week, and while New England's not an amazing matchup, it's a better one than Baltimore. So I guess you could look at Jalen Guyton. Now, I mentioned it all show long, but the Saints pass catchers are hurting right now. If Chris Olave and Rashid Shaheed are both out, then we're looking at A.T. Perry and Lynn Bowden as players who are going to run a lot of routes in that offense. I personally prefer Perry, even though he hasn't done that much over the last couple of weeks. He's seen target shares of just 10% and 5%. but his route participation has been high. It's a plus matchup overall for that passing attack, though, so I do think that Perry's in play, and Bowden is too. My goodness, this is a tough week. The last wide receiver in this tier, I'm going to go back to Justin Watson. His route participation last week really didn't change week over week. Rashee Rice was a little bit ahead of him in routes run, yes, but it wasn't by much. He only saw 3 targets, though, for a 9% target share. Justin Watson did. But don't forget that he had target shares of 18% and 28% in his 2 games prior to week 12. Green Bay is a pretty average matchup, maybe a little bit below average, but a player running routes and seeing looks in a Patrick Mahomes-led offense is worthy of a look, especially in a week like this one. And then the tight end in this tier is actually in that same game. It's Tucker Kraft. Like I talked about on the 10 Trends episode, the Packers basically just used Kraft this past week the same way they had been using Luke Musgrave. It's a tough matchup against Kansas City, there's no doubt, but any tight end who has a chance to run a route on 80% of his team's dropbacks is someone that you should be interested in, especially this far down the list. Now at defense this week, if you're looking for streamers, you could go with the Chargers against that brutal New England offense. You could look at the Rams against Cleveland, like I talked about in the 50 Transactions episode. And then there's the Falcons against the Jets, and they're fewer than 1 touchdown per game offense. I would say Jacksonville against Cincinnati, but they're rostered in too many leagues to get a shout here. And the same goes for Tampa Bay against Carolina. So we'll stick with those 3. Both LA teams, and then Atlanta. What could possibly go wrong? That's it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you yet subscribed to the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter at LateRoundQB. Make sure you follow the Late Round Fantasy Football Instagram account at LateRoundFF. And then there's YouTube as well, which is youtube.com/@LateRoundFF. Thanks for listening, everyone. I got the mailbag episode tomorrow and then another episode of Late Round Perspectives. I'll talk to you then.